Okay, well, my subject today, oh, not yet, with the images. My subject today is let's look at the land. Because we're used to spiritually looking at the land of Israel, and we're starting the book of Joshua. So we're looking at what it took physically and spiritually for Joshua to take that land. But many years ago, I had the privilege of writing a chapter of a Dorleen Kingsley Introduction to the Bible book about the physical geography and the history of the land of Israel. And I thought, rather than just delving into the spiritual application, it would be really good for us just to think a little bit outside the box about what it was that God asked Joshua to do, and then look at that, the difference that it makes to our lives, why this is relevant, why this is even interesting. So my talk today is called Let's Look at the Land. And the interesting thing about our faith is that it can be tested and proven in terms of history and in terms of geography. It's a physical, historical set of occurrences that are the genesis, the beginning of the relationship with God that we now stand in. And right back at the beginning of the beginning, God called Abraham, who was then Abram, who lived in Ur of the Chaldees, which was a sophisticated culture in the Euphrates basin, and he called him to have a relationship with him. He had already left that culture, and that was very normal in the age that he was living in. His father, Terah, took him and the sort of family clan, and even then, Terah was heading to the land of Canaan. He had decided to move there. But God said this to Abram, right back at the beginning. Let's go to Genesis. Let's try Genesis 12 and see what God says to him. Okay, so Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord says to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you." Now, this is God connecting with a human being personally. Archaeologists tell us that the culture that birthed Abraham was a very, very spiritual and religious one. You can see there's a beautiful golden statue of a ram caught in a thicket from Abram's home, Ur. But there are also graves in Ur where the master is obviously inside his very posh and impressive tomb. And there are literally, I think it's somewhere between 60 and 90 servants and some horses, who allowed themselves to be entombed with him, and then all took poison because they really wanted to serve him in the afterlife. And, she hadn't finished the polishing, so she'd finish off later on, sort of thing. So his wife and the whole household voluntarily went with him. Now, it's not a great thing, is it? But the point is, it was a very religious people. It was people who were believing in an afterlife and believing that you could do the right thing and believing that the afterlife was worth living for, or in this case, dying for. But you're talking about a community that is this so far from our values, our understanding of what it was to have a relationship with God. So it was this sort of person that God started to make a connection with. So poor Abram didn't know what God was like or what it was going to be like to be in connection with this God. But this is what God said to him. So you're going to leave, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed because of you. So God identifies himself as the God who wants to bless. He wants to connect. And also he wants to use the blessing that we receive to bless other people. And this is the key line, line 4. So Abram went. And he went with Lot. And let's not forget that at this point, he could have just said, no, thank you, actually. I'm part of a big community. I'm part of a way of seeing things. But actually what it says about Abram is, okay, okay. The whole Bible, right the way from Genesis to Revelation, is based on the story of human beings, normal people who say yes when God says something to them. They simply say, yes, yes, I will obey. I will choose to obey. I will choose to go with this. I think this is God, and I'm going to say yes to it. It's also the culture that made ziggurats. Have you heard of ziggurats? So massive towers with successive of smaller buildings on top reaching up to the sky. So it's probably the culture that literally produced the Tower of Babel. And when are we talking about? Well, we're probably talking about the something like 2150 BC. We're talking about mid-Bronze Age. If you're wanting to think, well, what was Britain like then? So in where Abraham came, there were these massive city-states with quite involved administrations, with each city had a king and a bureaucracy and an army, and sometimes other cities like Uruk and they competed with each other and they went to war with each other. But together, they created this culture that we now think of as the Sumerian culture. Back in Britain at the time, well, we weren't doing very much. We were sort of chasing around over the wild cattle at the time that we actually made extinct. They were called uruks, and they were like our cows, but they were huge. They were much, much bigger. We were living in little villages, in little round huts, and we managed to make an axe. So that's where we were at. We were very pleased with ourselves. We'd made an axe. And this is where they were at in Sumer, and around that culture. So he came from a sophisticated culture, and a culture that had this sense of religion, this sense of the spiritual. But by comparison, we were chasing uruks, we were using bows and arrows, and we were very, very primitive. We might have made the odd knife, but we'd just come out of the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, okay? So this is when Jacob was around. When Abraham was around. Then you've got just a couple of generations later, the story of Jacob. Let's look at Genesis again, 28 this time, just a little bit further on. So do you remember the story of Abraham? You've got this, Abram becomes Abraham. You've got this divine connection with him. You've got this intervention from God that produces a child when he is very, very old. So, he was probably 70 when he set off on this jaunt. And God says, I'm going to make you a great nation. Now, even at that stage, which is comparatively youthful for Abram, it was a hugely tall order that he said, okay, then I'll go. And he got as far as Haran, and then he left his father Terah, or his grandfather Terah, we're not sure quite what generation it was, and went into Canaan, where he ended up just buying a simple plot of land to bury his wife. 2 generations later, he has a son by divine intervention. He has Isaac, even though he and his wife are very old. Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob gets into all sorts of problems with his brother, runs away. And I'm going to pick up the story in Genesis 28. This is literally in the land of Canaan, and I'm going to read to you from verse 13. He sees, do you remember this story? He sees a staircase open above his head, connecting heaven and earth. And he sees God at the top of this staircase. And he hears God saying this to him, I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying now. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. Again, look at this. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed because of you and through your offspring. So right at the beginning of the proto-Jewish nation, you've got God saying it's about connecting with me, it's about my desire to bless you, and through you, everyone. He's definitely playing the long game, is God. He takes one old man who lives in a different part of the world, who can't have children. Through that old man, believing him, he creates a micronation, a family, basically. Into that family, he starts keeping seeding, destiny, hope. But clearly in the DNA of the Jewish nation is, you are not to be my favorites for your own sake. You are to be a blessing to the world. That is your whole purpose. That's who you are. That's why I'm creating you, to bless everyone. And Jacob receives that word. Then, do you remember his son Joseph goes to Egypt, and for 430 years, his people, his family, are nowhere near Canaan at all. Now, I would love that first image. Thank you so much, Ed. Ed whirs into action, just when I'd got him nice and settled. And this is a literal painting from one of the tombs in Egypt of a pharaoh in a place called Beni Hassan. And here you can see people that they describe as Asiatic people from the east side of the Mediterranean coming in a time of famine to Egypt. So this is literally what Jacob and his family could have looked like. They're amazing illustrations, and the artist has actually taken great care with things like the instruments that they're carrying. They've got 3 children with them, do you see? Their animals and their passion. They've all got this lovely off-the-shoulder number that they were obviously very into. The patterns of the weaves of their clothes. You can see the Egyptians have a different color skin. So this is the first thing that we get that's close to a portrait of Jacob or of Joseph. You can see what they were doing with their hair and their beards. And they were coming into Egypt. Now, this isn't literally a painting of Joseph or Jacob, but it's from the period. And it shows the sort of thing that we're talking about. So you've then got 430 years where they're nowhere near the land, where they're settled in Goshen, they're pastoralists, they're herders. And as you know, it all goes wrong. They end up being slaves. So you've got 430 years in Egypt. Then you've got Moses. Let's look with me at Exodus 3, verse 8. Burning bush story. The people are not holding on to God. They're not connected with God. Okay, let's go from verse 8. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and I am going to bring them out into their own land. And it's a good and spacious land. It will be a land flowing with milk and honey. And the Lord makes it really clear at present it is the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Pezerites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Because now the cry of Israel has reached me, and I've seen the way that the Egyptians are treating them. So this is, again, God playing the long game. This is hundreds of years later, and he's still going on about this people, about there's going to be a special place for you. There's going to be the land. There's going to be this place that at the moment is occupied by these other people. So let's literally physically look at the land then. Moses never made it. Can we have it a bit bigger or not? Right, that's telling me. Good, that's that then. Good, no, we can't have it bigger than that. But it does show you at the time, over here in Egypt, this is where the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people as they were then known. Oh yes, come on, were over there. But this here is the land that God started speaking to them about. And let's just look at it for a little minute, because all the Bible stories from this point onwards happen here. One thing, I've never been there. How many of us have been there? Have any of us been there? Oh, goodness. How many of us haven't been there? About 3 of us haven't been there, yeah. So, I mean, the rest of you know about this much more than I do, actually. But let's just think about it a little bit, sort of physically. Do you know it's only 150 miles long? It's absolutely tiny. Israel, it's really small, the promised land. It affects the culture of the whole of the world, and it's a tiny, tiny little strip of a place. It's not very big. You've got, you can see the coastal line of the east end of the Mediterranean there. Well, to be quite honest with you, the Hebrew people never really got that far. They should have, but they didn't take it. They didn't get as far as the coast. So the Phoenicians are up to the north of us, and into the south came the Philistines around the same sort of time that the Hebrew people were taking the land. The Philistines got in there too. But if you're thinking about what this land is like, you can see here the Dead Sea. That's the lowest point on the whole globe. It's 2,000, I think it's, let me have written in my notes, 2,600 feet below the level of the sea. It's the lowest point on the earth. It's absolutely rich with minerals, partly because of the Dead Sea as a land. There's a lot of amazing stuff going on there chemically. Up from the Dead Sea, you can see the Jordan. Well, that's a rift valley. Those of you that are you as interested in this as I am? I'm fascinated by all this stuff. Yeah, no, I am. No, it's good. The Rift Valley is like literally deep, sudden, and it's where 2 tectonic plates are separating. Let me show you again. 2 tectonic plates separating. Africa heading west, yeah? Everything to the east heading east, and actually the Rift Valley of the Jordan River is getting wider. Year on, year out, it's getting wide, but it's very, very deep. As 2 big plates of the Earth's crust slowly, slowly, slowly drift apart. From the sea to the Jordan River, you've got a sort of a feeling, basically, of a sort of shallow roof rising. That's what Israel, that's how it works. So you've got the hill country, which is virtually unfarmable, but you've got the plain of Sharon, and then further up around Galilee, which is actually very fertile in places. It's sort of basalt, but with good fertile soil in between, in basins. So lovely farming land. So when God said it's flowing with milk and honey, he didn't exaggerate. It was actually great fertile soil and a very nice climate, not too hot, not too cold. This image doesn't have the mountains on it, but there are a few key mountains there. And when we're talking about Israel, most of the time we're talking about the land that became known as Dan, because the tribe of Dan took it in the north, and then right the way down to Beersheba in the south. So we're talking about a strip that can be maybe 50 miles wide in some places, north to south. Let me just show you where the tribes settled. Can I see the next image, Ed? There we go. So, this is the land of Israel, but in terms of, rather than physical geography, it's human geography now. And you can still see these sort of gaps, as it were, the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. You can still see the river. But this is where the tribes were given clearly defined, marked areas of land that they could call their homeland, okay? They didn't get as far as they could or should have got. They were certainly the dominant people, the Hebrew people in this land, but there were plenty of other people left there that they didn't actually knock out of the picture as they were told to. So although they were the ruling force in the land, they weren't the only people living in Israel by any means during the Bible times. But you can see the Judah heartland down in the south, where you get Jerusalem created a little bit later. You've got Hebron in the north. That little dot is Galilee. one of the reasons that we think that they never got particularly into fishing in the Mediterranean like the Phoenicians did was because they had so many fish in Galilee. They had fabulous fish, so they had very plentiful stuff just in the land itself. They didn't really need to go further away. Okay, so that gives you a sort of an overview. You've got a fertile place, you've got some mountainous country. It's not very big. In biblical terms, it's flowing with milk and honey. Now, this is the next picture. This is the really important one. May I see? Okay, let's put this land in geopolitical and geographical context. Okay, do you remember I said right at the beginning that Abraham came from a place called Ur, yeah? In the land of Sumer. This was the city-states. Probably, we don't know this for certain, but we think this was the civilization that first created writing. We're going to go back, but can I just have a quick, we'll go back to this, but yeah, there it is. That's obviously Dear Diary from about 3300 BC. It was made with a stylus made out of reed, which was a sort of triangular shaped reed, and they literally just stamped it in to wet clay. And as in every culture, the first bit of writing that you've got is a sort of financial inventory. So-and-so owes so much for so many fish. And they did that a lot. So that's cuneiform writing. That is the first writing known to man. And that would have been going around by the time that Abram was born. That would have been quite common. We've got loads of these shards of pottery. There are loads of them because they, in the heat of the desert land that we're talking about, they are preserved really, really well. Can I have the next image? No, on one again. There we go. Do you recognize what this is? This is Egyptian hieroglyphics. They probably started at maybe half a millennium later, maybe 400 years later. They started creating a picture language which wouldn't have been able to be read by your normal Egyptians. It was really only the priests that understood it and could write it or could decipher it. It's mostly written on the tombs, and it's ceremonial and it's prayers and that sort of thing, but there's also, of course, the financial inventory stuff. But most of their normal hieroglyphics would have been written on papyrus, which was the paper made out of reeds, which hasn't lasted. So we don't know most about what the Egyptians write about. Now, if we can go back to the map, 2 plates earlier. Now, do you see this land of Canaan that God said, I want my people to live in? It's in an arch. You've heard this term, I'm sure, when people are talking about the Bible, called the Fertile Crescent, yeah? So basically, you're talking about all this area down here. This is desert. That over here down there, that's desert. You've got this thin strip. Let me do that again. It's fun. Thin strip where the waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris and the rainfall coming east off the Mediterranean makes the land habitable. And you can actually farm it. And it's called the Fertile Crescent because you've got this massive culture of Egypt where they've got writing going on. You've got this fabulous culture of the city-states around Ur and Uruk, Tigris and the Euphrates, later Nineveh becoming huge. And there's an arch between them. Can you see how the bit that God said, I want my people to be in, is like a bottleneck? Yeah? It's very narrow, but every sort of trade that went between these two, gigantic cultures had to come through Canaan. So he didn't just give them a nice looking land. It wasn't just a lush place that he had up his sleeve that he thought, ooh, that'll be quite nice for my special people. It was actually a strategic land. Everyone who was everyone had to go through there. It wasn't just a pleasant place that happened to be, a great place of real estate that he thought would be attractive. It was a place that, to be quite honest with you, you couldn't hold without God, because everyone wanted control of this strip. Yeah? it wasn't just in a nice location, it was strategic. If you held that strip, you could tax your traders coming out of Egypt on their camels, you could tax your merchants coming out of Sumer on your donkeys. You literally held civilization if you held that strip of land. So turn with me, please, to Deuteronomy chapter 8. This was said before they got into the promised land by Moses. And look at about verse 11. This is God saying, I'm worried about this, or if you like, I'm warning you about this. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord, your God, and fail to observe his commands. Otherwise, when you are in the land, you will eat and be satisfied, you'll build fine houses and settle down. And when your flocks and herds grow large and your silver and gold increase, you could become proud and forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt where you were slaves. He led you through vast wilderness, and he brought you to this place. You might say to yourself, it's my power and strength that have produced this wealth for me. But remember, it's the Lord your God. He gives you the ability to produce wealth. Verse 19, if you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will be destroyed like the nations that the Lord destroyed before you. So you too will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord. So the Lord gave them a present, but it was a present that they could not possibly hold on to without him. Yeah? The biggest part of the gift that God gave them was a necessity for dependence. They were a small nation. They weren't as technologically as advanced as these guys and these guys. Interestingly, while they were there, the Canaanite peoples, who they never totally eradicated, developed the alphabet. Let me see, I think we've got a picture of the alphabet a few slides down. It all happened. Isn't it interesting where God wanted to spread his good news? That was the place. So that's the first alphabet. Before that, you've got pictures meaning words, basically. The people in Sumer were very clever. They got into abstract terms by linking pictures together. So you could, the equivalent of a thin word, you've got a picture for thin and a picture for a king. And they thought, oh, you put those together, you've got a picture for thinking. And that's literally what they did. Yeah, very clever. The Egyptians didn't really have that. But the first alphabet was actually developed in the north of Israel, in the Canaanite territory. And it's this alphabet that you could then transpose into any language, you see. So it allowed ideas to be propagated. Isn't it interesting that it happened just where God had called his people to be? In the whole history of the world, it all happened here. Look at that. So that's the very, very first alphabet, which was used by many, many language groups. The other thing that's really interesting, just as a sort of somebody who's interested in archaeology, which I said, didn't I, that Abraham came sort of middle Bronze Age. Now we're talking about, by the time we've got the land, you've got hundreds of years later, we're talking about late Bronze Age. So what do you use to make bronze? You use copper and tin, okay? So tin, can we go back to the land of the Fertile Crescent would be gorgeous. Just up here in Turkey, you've got massive tin mines. Anatolia, it would have been known as then. So you've got lots of tin. And right just here, in the very south of Israel, just up here is the Gulf of Aqaba, you have copper. So they literally were sitting, you've heard of Solomon and his mines. They used to think that, that must mean that there was gold. There wasn't gold in the Promised Land. there was copper. And in fact, in 2013, they carbon dated some of the stuff that they found in from one of the mines there to exactly the end of Solomon's period. I know, it's quite something, isn't it? It's quite something. So he gave them everything to flourish. They got fish, they got food, they got tin to make bronze, they've got an alphabet going on, but they've only got it if they stay close to God's heart. Now, this is where I'm coming into land, because I'm hoping that you find this interesting, because I think it's so interesting to think these were real people. This was a real time and a real place. What is our promised land? What are the things that God has spoken to you and given you vision for your family, for your own life, for your freedom? You know, it might be freedom from alcohol, freedom from debt, freedom to have confidence in yourself, freedom to do things artistically, creatively, freedom to be sociable, freedom to excel academically. He will give each one of us, and does give us, a promised land. But it is not meant to be a promised land that should become a pitfall to us. Oh, by my own strength and wealth I've done this. Aren't I a clever boy? Aren't I a clever girl? Yeah? Jamie, our youngest one, who, as you know, has gone off to a really good university, he stammered so badly when he was a little boy that he would hit his head on the table to try to get the words out. Poor little Jamie. And go bright red in the face. He had years of, it was speech therapy, but it was really psychotherapy to help him. One of the greatest things that Jamie has as a person, yes, he's able, but his gift is dependency on God. He couldn't speak when he was little. He literally couldn't speak like the other boys and girls could. But actually, the thing that has been his vulnerability has become his strength. Because he learned the depth of character and perseverance and clinging on to God in a way that people that have no disadvantages or pressures on their lives don't ever have to develop. So where you have your weaknesses, if you will make them a recipe to depend and turn to Father, if you don't find it easy to make friends, if you don't find it easy to think cerebrally, if you don't find it easily to physically do things, if you're not so incredible, that could be the secret of your success. You know, it's so sad, but the people who lived in Israel, the Jewish people, because they didn't follow God's ways, as you know, they were taken over by the superpowers that rose up in this area. First of all, the Assyrians took the 10 tribes of Israel, and then the Babylonians came right the way into Jerusalem and took Jerusalem. And then you've got the Persians, then the Greeks, and then finally Rome dominating that land. But that was never what God wanted. If you stay close to God, he prospers you. He promises to bless you. And he does the same today.